As the 19th century progressed, the relationship between the old art of painting and that revolutionary invention of photography became more intimate and increasingly complex. Photography first appeared in an age which greatly admired artists who were able to reproduce scenes in realistic detail. And that, of course, is what the camera could do with all the precision of a machine. It was excellent for architectural detail, and subjects which defied the cleverest brush were now simply printed by the action of light and a layer of chemicals. The camera also reproduced the human face more honestly and efficiently than the portrait painters of the time. The reaction of painters to the invention of photography was confused. Some of them were simply afraid of the camera. They saw it as a competitor, an image machine which might put them out of work. And some of them even predicted the end of art. But the more confident painters welcomed photography as a servant, which would take some of the drudgery out of art. Nowadays, we can have our picture taken on street corners and shops, or like here in a railway station. What used to take perhaps a dozen sittings in a portrait painter's studio is now just a matter of dropping in a few coins, posing yourself, and then waiting a couple of minutes for a print, which will show any expression you choose. Now, surprisingly, these automatic photo booths were actually in operation as early as 1889. And photography had been affecting art for 50 years before that. And back in the 1840s, the artists worst hit by the invention of the image machine were naturally the portrait painters. The kind of people who could afford a painted portrait of themselves hadn't paid artists to be honest. They looked instead not just for a likeness, but for a work of art which proclaimed their quality. Photography's influence here was soon apparent. Even in the work of an artist who paints clothes and faces with a subtlety no camera could match, the hand props up the head. Just as it did so often in photographs of the period when heads had to be held steady during the long exposures to make sure the image was sharp. It's interesting that the vast majority of early photographs were in fact portraits, mementos of friends and family. At a time when the growth of industry at home and the advance of empire abroad was breaking up the old ways of life, the importance of family ties was put on display for all to see. And the best advertisement for family life was the example of Victoria herself. The Queen's devotion to her large family seems to have encouraged her enthusiasm for photography. She certainly had no worries about its low artistic status and willingly posed for pictures. But tradition still dictated that painters present her formally as a queen. This portrait was actually painted in 1855, the same year this photograph was taken, which sold 100,000 copies. Victoria once asked the portrait painter if he thought photography would ever do him out of a job. "Oh no, madam," he replied. "Photography cannot flatter." The reputation of politicians was also helped by a good image. The gaunt Abraham Lincoln is transformed by the painter into a far-sighted president of the United States. And a photograph of the Southern commander, Robert E. Lee, also got the cosmetic treatment from a painter who squared the general's shoulders and puffed out his chest. This photograph of Princess Marie was taken by Beatrix Potter's father, and it was then copied by the painter Sir John Millais, who changed it subtly. The knitting, the dress, and the hairstyle all stay the same, but the open, apprehensive face of the child in the photograph, when painted, is given the serenity and confidence expected of an English princess. Odalisque by the French painter Delacroix was also based on a photograph, although the model was only posed to match a scene already worked out in the artist's mind. A friend of the painter said, Delacroix's imagination transformed models hired at 3 francs a session into dreamers and nymphs. Other photographs commissioned by Delacroix were given the same treatment. The romantic artist was always trying to turn the ordinary into the ideal. The real thing, even in a photograph, would offend people of good taste. One man who offended good taste was Gustave Courbet, the French artist who called himself a realist. Courbet's work might look pretty conventional today, but back in the 1850s, his paintings were abused as banal scenes worthy only of the daguerreotype. Courbet had actually painted his own townspeople from life, not from photographs. Indeed, he didn't much care for photography, but he did sometimes enjoy using photographs to help him send up the conventions. He painted this woman bathing in a style usually reserved for goddesses, and he outraged the Paris salon. At the center of his frame, Courbet then placed a new hero for the world to admire, himself, the artist as rebel. French painters began to treat with some reverence another subject which art had neglected. This is Millet's The Gleaners. This man is a stonebreaker. It was the world of the common people, the exploited workers, the peasants in the countryside. Like the camera, the paintings tried to show the real world around them. Realistic art is essentially democratic art, the realist said, and we cannot paint what we cannot see. And Courbet, by attacking the romantic notion of art for art's sake, had challenged the old system of cultural values, which encouraged painters to tackle subjects like Oedipus conversing with a sphinx. Erotic scenes were permitted, as long as they showed respectable subjects, like classical matrons enjoying their public bath. When photography aspired to this kind of high art, it seemed almost indecent. The visual rhetoric of the Oath of the Horatii might echo off the great canvas of David, but the camera's hard eye just couldn't take this kind of posturing seriously. Establishment painters in England were less troubled by subversion. Britain, after all, was the strongest country in the world, and that confidence showed in its paintings. If you look at these pictures, they tell stories. Some of them are patriotic, some of them are religious, and some of them are domestic. But the Victorian picture tried to reflect 3 things: truth, moral uplift, and sentiment. Among the most popular paintings were those of Edwin Landseer. Along with the ideal of bold leadership, he offered a counterpoint of devoted service. To get the most out of these Victorian paintings, people had to read them for their social messages. This is hope, which is blind. Victorian photographers also tried to exploit popular sentiments with studies like youth and old age. This is Innocence. The lesson. And, more wistfully, he never told his love. The most ambitious art photograph was The 2 Ways of Life, made by Oscar Rylander, who stuck 30 separate negatives together to contrast wild living on the one hand with the benefits of hard work on the other. But Rylander's nudes looked so seductive that before they could be shown in Scotland, the decadent end was draped and only hard work was an offer to the public. Rylander also hoped that his photographs would be of use to artists. His friend Henry Peach Robinson even sketched out his art photographs before posing his models. Using a landscape photograph for background, Robinson would then dress up his models, photograph them separately, then paste them together to complete the composite scene. The effect of this photocomposite technique, common by the 1850s, can also be seen in the contemporary paintings of the pre-Raphaelites, whose pursuit of truth through fine detail produced a rather similar, flat, fragmented quality. But for painters in the business of telling stories, the more photographic the detail, the more convincing the scene. This painted melodrama of the adulterous wife exposed by her husband is packed with clues to her downfall. Her children's house of cards collapses. The shaky foundation was her book, a French realist novel by Balzac. And the woman's apple is rotten at the core. Not all the story pictures which try to maintain moral standards were quite so explicit. This is called simply the confession. You know, the odd thing about paintings like this and the role they played 100 years ago is it actually suggests a parallel with the role of television today. Because television also works inside and supports a very strong social consensus. In fact, in Britain, we even declare that television's job is to inform, educate, and entertain. And of course, these Victorian pictures, like television today, were enormously popular. The Victorians also liked to see themselves on canvas, and they were impressed with the skill required to make the crowd scenes look convincing. But the Art Journal warned in the 1850s that it could see an increasing number of pictures in which the aid of the camera is apparent. Frith had actually hired a photographer, William Fry, to help him capture the bustle of Paddington railway station, although the photographs have vanished. For his painting of Derby Day, he hired another professional photographer, Robert Howlett. Frith was secretive about his use of photographs, and only one survives. It shows the grandstand and the crowd in front of it. Some of its groupings and the texture of the crowd can be guessed at in the final painting. But Frith has thoroughly reworked this documentary material. He was, after all, a highly accomplished painter who simply used photographs to broaden his range and prompt his memory. However, it just wasn't done in those days for a successful establishment painter to admit publicly his debt to the low craft of the camera. The German artist von Lenbach, posing here with his family, was more open about his use of photographs, and he was attacked for it by the British painter Sir Hubert Herkomer. "I see most clearly in von Lenbach's art," said Herkomer, "the side that has been fostered by photography. The glassy look, so often mistaken for intellectuality, is the eye that has stared into the camera for several seconds, fixedly. It is easy to copy, and if the artist only dares to put it all into his pictures, it secures for him a type of work that may be taken for originality. I deny it gives a true reflection of the mind of the sitter." Towards the end of the century, the influence of the camera was so pervasive in paintings, like St. Martin's in the Field by William Logsdale, that one critic guessed half the paintings he saw in modern exhibitions were developments of photographs. Some even projected photographs straight onto canvas, then painted it. Such paintings, another critic warned, only anticipated photography in color. Whatever the critics said, the camera's influence was also increased because it satisfied a public demand. The artist patrons among the prosperous middle class liked a naturalistic style in the paintings hung as symbols of their newly acquired culture. Meanwhile, other aspects of camera vision were intriguing the avant-garde painters of France. This painting by Manet shows the execution of the Emperor Maximilian of Mexico in 1867. The emperor and his generals face a firing squad of 7 men. A photograph of the same event, most probably a composite, was on sale in Paris. So, at first glance, it doesn't look as though Manet's painting owes much to photography. But other photographs were also on sale. General Miramont in a photograph and in the painting. Emperor Maximilian in the painting and in a photograph. The second dead general, Mayer, and his published photograph. The photographs were for documentary reference, but the firing squad isn't arranged documentary style. Other influences are at work here. Manny's painting is also an echo of a painting by Goya of rebels being shot back in 1808. But where Goya 60 years before painted a story which implied a heroic past, a brutal present, and future defiance, Manny, by contrast, freezes the moment, as the camera might do, leaving the observer to find horror in the fact. When the camera became sophisticated enough to take to the streets, it soon caught the hurried random side of city life in a haphazard way which fascinated the more experimental painters. The blur of movement, the lack of focus, even the angle of view used by the painters is the same as that used by the photographers who first took pictures of traffic and pedestrians around 1860. This is Manny's impressionistic study of Boulevard des Capucines. The randomness of the photograph with its abrupt cut-off composition also began to appear in paintings. This is another Manny painting titled On the Beach, Trouville. The camera could also hold a single striking pose which might stick in the mind of an artist. Fernand Knopf used this photograph for a painting he called Memories. This photograph shows the painter James Tissot with a Mrs. Newton and her two children. From it, he made a painting called Waiting for the Ferry. In fact, Mrs. Newton was Tissot's mistress, and in the painting, the couple are much more intimate. Tissot hides his head, and Mrs. Newton becomes sadder and lovelier than the matter-of-fact Mrs. Newton in the original photograph. Edgar Degas was an enthusiast for instantaneous photography. It was said that he combined the snapshot with endless labor in the studio. This portrait card sold by a Paris photographer of the Prince and Princess de Metternich obviously appealed to Degas. He was so taken by the princess that he got rid of the prince and with him the lady's left arm to leave this portrait. Degas also shared something of the photographer's feel for accuracy. When the true position of a horse's leg at the gallop were discovered by Edward Muybridge, the pioneer of motion photography, Degas at once began to paint his horses accurately, though unconventionally for the time. And while Muybridge was busy in the United States, another man was at work in Paris. He wasn't a photographer. He was a scientist called Professor Marey, a physiologist. And he was interested in photography because it would help him with his experiments. And he built in a park in Paris a place like this. He called it his black hole. It was simply draped with black velvet at the back here. And across the stage came all sorts of things, including men in white suits. Now, what Marey was interested in was the pure scientific analysis of motion. But oddly enough, the people who got most excited about it were the artists. Because until then, pictures had simply shown an event frozen in time. What Marey's photographs showed was an event extended through both space and time. Just as the photographs you've seen have shown me coming up on the stage, coming across it, there, 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 and now here. And will shortly show me going there, there, and there. Because one of the things that most excited the artists was, in fact, a very commonplace experiment that Marey did, showing a man going down a staircase. Marcel Duchamp took this for his famous study, Nude Descending a Staircase. As part of his investigation of movement, Professor Marey also used a man in a black suit with a white stripe down the side to perform for the special camera. This exercise created a pattern. And this pattern was later used by the Italian futurist painter Balla. So, although the camera first appeared to confirm an objective natural view of the world, it had proved to have inside it the power to subvert the belief that the only visual truth was the one which the eye was trained to take for granted. This is a boulevard scene painted by Renoir, who said, "Photography has freed painting from a lot of tiresome chores, starting with family portraits. So much the worse for us, so much the better for the art of painting." And Picasso later added that photography helped liberate painting from all literature, from the anecdote, and even from the subject. The humble photograph, having displaced the old portrait painters and encouraged the copyists, came in the end to inspire artists in a revolutionary response to the interplay of pure light and color and shape. Today, at galleries like the Hayward here in London, photographs are hung as confidently as paintings. Right across a whole range of styles and intentions, the photograph is now treated as a respectable art object. On this wall, the well-composed views of urban dereliction, still as sad, but still as picturesque as all those photographs of Victorian slums taken 100 years ago. On the other wall here, there are photographs claiming to be landscapes, but they're abstracted through the camera out of all recognition, in a way quite alien to the Victorian tradition. It's an example of photography acknowledging the influence of modern art. The war between art and photography is now over, but back in Victorian times, artists like William Frith were forced to deny they ever used photographs because there was such a stigma attached to that practice. So great indeed that it might even have threatened their professional status. But by the end of the century, attitudes were changing, and so too were the public's attitude towards artists themselves. The artist, far from being an establishment figure, was now increasingly seen as the outsider, as a disturbed visionary, like Edvard Munch, who also said that he had nothing to fear from photography because photographs couldn't be used in heaven or in hell. But Munch himself wasn't above making use of photographs right here on Earth. Today, it's taken for granted that art and photography feed off each other. And the British artist David Hockney, for instance, says this of photography: "I use photographs for reference, but if you haven't taken the photograph yourself, you can only do something imaginative with it." And that's exactly what Hockney's done in this photograph, taken by Edward Muybridge 100 years ago. Muybridge's studies of movement were being used at the end of the last century by artists of the stature of Degas, Millet, and Rodin. And today, they're still used in art classes. Muybridge's intention was to analyze action, as in his photographs of men wrestling. But Francis Bacon turns the basic material into something quite different. Art and photography are now fused together. And looking back, we can see that right from the beginning, the camera had encouraged painters in new ways of seeing. And it was the painters that we now value most highly who absorbed that experience in the 19th century and then transcended it. One last example. This is a rather ordinary photograph of a snow scene taken in Fontainebleau around 1880. And that same photograph as seen by Paul Cézanne.
The last episode of the camera series on early photography is Wheel of Life, Movement. In it, Gus MacDonald demonstrates the amazing range of optical toys which helped the Victorians transform still photographs into moving pictures. By the end of the last century, photography and science had come together to create a new art form, the movies.